Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So we now on week 12's subject, and really on the verge of the end of this semester. We, as usual, deals with the topics in two sessions. The topic that would be dealt in this class, they cover licensing for the first half of this class, and perhaps in the second session I hopefully advance to the issue or the volume of rule making, timeliness, participation, and the points about bureaucratic discretion, the effects of rule making, and also inseparable issues. This point of a consideration would actually stems from the kind of some disgruntled American public about the policymakers. Now I have read one interesting newspaper titled "The Rule of Nobody," also by Phillips, and actually there are many issues, but we see any effective public administration of a long time. Of course, let me illustrate empirical evidence from a public poll. For example, shortly after September 11th, general levels of public confidence have risen to 60%, according to Gallup poll. But a few months later, the number had again dropped to 45% and continued to fall into the end of a George W. Bush administration. So the time period is quite in emergency, as you expect, and the American public actually shares a same compassion about the national administration and others. So the circumstances would differ from normal context. But still worse, as you expect. And one moderate think tank, Thirdway, actually advocated for trust in government initiative as part of the Obama agenda. The Pew poll also found that 57%, a majority of Americans, believe that the public sector was inefficient and wasteful. This number is an improvement of previous years, and one has to wonder what role the economic crisis and the election of President Barack Obama had to affect this. So skepticism, outright hostility toward the federal government, reached unprecedented levels throughout the 1980s, the 1990s, and into the new millennium years. Demands for specific public responses to private needs and desires continued unabated. So one point we need to make a highlight in this class would be the volume of rule making. Actually, that should be adequate, as you surmise. There are many points about that perhaps, for example, the excessive volume would require much resources and workforces to implement and enact the regulation and others. And also the lack or insufficiency of rules would mislead the proper response against challenges and issues. So the basic tenet in this course would have considered many factors about this cause and consequence through the American public lives. So, what consequence could we identify when the administration is not responsible properly about its capabilities, for example, and how to make it to penetrate through the regulated community, and or the limitations of information or limitations of rule makers would be two major contributors about this irrationalities, or in some cases contingent difficulties from many pressures and strains. So we also consider the strain on institutional capacity, which actually influences the volume of rule making. And the next point, which seems to be critical about the public good that is what they anticipated to produce for improvement of our life quality or any fair administration of our public issues and others. The complexity and controversy would often create the kind of situation that the response would be untimely or came later or aggregates earlier to prejudice the intent or goals of legislature orders. And also procedural requirements would be one factor. And shortage of resources are also a variant we need to see through the element of timeliness. And also I advise on management obstacles and deficiencies. And in some circumstances, the administrative agency may apply technical delays for the institutional objective or organizational command from many structures and substantive elements, and participation and bureaucratic discretion are factors as you expect about the issues and contradictions. And we also lastly touched on inseparable issues. And licensing is another concern in this class. As you expect, the administrative agency often create a variety of licensing programs and administer its intended goals. So what do you expect from that administrative technique license? Actually, in this deal of licensing or related programs, the administrative agency would play to create the standard or about granting a license, for example. And they also may create rules about the conditions for revoking the license. So, and also suspension might be available about driver's license and many occupational licenses, a medical license, a bar license, others. And the Congress may engage in actually as an ultimate authority about licensing and others by enacting statute and providing any pivotal guidelines about the system of license, and nonetheless, still the role and responsibility of a administrative agency would most elementary to create by creating the standards and implementing the disciplinary hearings about, for example, medical doctors and bar members of state judiciary, and also you consider most popular the context of a driving license. We generally refer to the familiar and often a nerve-wracking experience nearly all teenagers go through getting a driver's license. So that is part of the lives very essentially, and might feel affinity throughout the spending of their days and weeks, so much attractive and favorite perhaps. And the suspension would mean virtually a critical disruption about their daily lives. It is a basic, and but nonetheless, you may feel it a little trivial as related to daily chores and many basic functions of a but not critical, perhaps. Nonetheless, assume this kind of situation, or for example, this safety issue at a nuclear power plant. Consider the also the service of USA Forest. The U.S. Forest Service would manage the kind of occupational license about cutting timber and earning their income from that source of a permission. So the logo must get permission from the U.S. Forest Service, and might be life or death situation for only ways about a subsistence discernible just in case. And also medical and other professional license would come in a similar consideration against the previous example, a drive license. So the scope of license could vary very extensively. For example, the pattern, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission consider if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission does not establish a licensing procedure for the proposed national high-level radioactive waste dam in Yucca Mountain, Nevada, then the U.S. Department of Energy will let them build a repository for the existing waste generated by private nuclear power and government nuclear weapons facilities, let alone future waste. So in this case, you will find some of a very important consequence about a licensing program. That is networked and they bridge it into with many other important public issues. So it might raise a kind of a so many controversies about what actually policy administrators and many stakeholders in coverage of a civil activist group and others. So quite presumed about a further process in terms of a public production of goodness, what I say. And consider some private aspect of issue. For example, what is that a FCC, the federal regulator about broadcasting company, and licensing about the related activities of businesses and industries. For example, the radio bandwidth, which it is economical to design and sell receivers, is a limited resource. And a grant license to deal with this kind of business is quite consequential through the private businesses and concerned industries. And once a license is granted, the successful businesses would actually quite fortunate, which draws as plenty of income automatically by just a licensing. So in some other dimension, the controversy has been charted in a recent Korean public issue, this picture shows the concerned people about the freedom of press and in the fear of monopoly about press and communication television and cable businesses have been discussed previously, whether it is proper to include kind of a major newspaper companies, Chosun, Chungang, and Tonga. And so the public opinion and many important intelligent theme of society would be actually in fair danger about a monopoly. So and the public disagreement has fairly been intense over the process, and they later have achieved that ambition to settle into years of a stable practice. So now considered very successful, and perhaps now the kind of controversy has in app, as you know, it would not mean that the business would lucrative or highly profitable. So economic aspect would not be determinative. Nonetheless, still the characteristic of business is quite determinative about the share of a public impression on the side of the involved concerned businesses, Chosun, Chungang, and Tonga. And also the article accepted from internet source disclosed that some politicians from a ruling party have changed their initial position and ethos or actually the contact against the major newspaper companies. So the interest and concerns have been complicated in multifaceted demand and from many diverse sources of influence. And Hung Gil-go is a representative of Hannara Party, now reformed in new name into Senuri Party. We see we'll soon have a local election, and actually highly interested in its outcome about a present status of partisan politics. So the policymakers in this concern actually undertakes a quite important role, as I mentioned, about the network of public opinion pressure, the kind of a civilian voice of pressure, and interchange about, well, actually, as one constitutional scholar named Mark John has expressed, the free flow in the market, free flow of ideas in the market is actually an important determinant in assessing the modern democracy. And the First Amendment rights in the freedom of press has long been enriched in its substance and content from court rulings. So how to administer licensing standard about selection of a proper business in cable TV business is actually critical in structuring the new emerge of a cable or business in South Korea. Then, at this point of time, we now have some reports about the reason for a licensing system. For probable candidates could be presented to your review. What is that? A control of public resources and a fair allocation of limited resources, and assurance of competence in complex and dangerous occupations, and maintenance of public order. The then fourth factor will not differ in any critically, perhaps a slide. Consider, for example, poor automobile driving can cause as much harm as medical malpractice. So two systems may share about the same Polish reason about licensing system, maintenance of public order. So can an unregulated access to alcoholic beverages, which gave rise to laws in some states limiting the number of suppliers. So it also serves a maintenance of public order, and in many states, see in the U.S. context, the number of suppliers were statutorily limited. The license requirement for drivers and liquor sellers, however, does not involve detailed tests and standards of performance designed to increase the competence of the licensee. In professional licensing, by contrast, the candidate must demonstrate his or her mastery of a large quantity of complex material. where the license seeks to maintain public order. It is the threat of losing the license that produced the great sanctioning effect. So liquor managers may obtain a adequate education in the end to sustain the license. Renewal might depend on further subsequent education. Others, but the point is that the liquor store may comply. They refuse to sell to minors, but the inference, the reason perhaps will not because of professional training in liquor school, but because they face the threat of losing their license if caught. So the continued surveillance or monitoring about the licensing field is important about the state authority and many public organizations. For example, the Medical Malpractice Board or other professional unit to apply a disciplinary hearing orders would get to reach the same concern. And the state administrators often elaborate to refine the management system. For example, point the system about a driver license now considered very prevailing in the American jurisdictions. And the point system actually is contended about this pre-termination hearing in the court proceedings. For example, the cases related with that issue, Dixon versus Love, and that would arise from the state of Illinois about the license of a truck driver, and we'll consider later about its fact. And also now the 39 states in United States adopted a one-strike policy, meaning the driver license is revoked, and in some cases the automobile seized if it is established the person's blood alcohol content is above the legal limit, which ranges between 0.808% and 0.10% by weight of person's total blood volume, or if a person refused to take a breath analyzer test. So now the public safety in the highway or on the road is quite attentive as you consider, and pressuring concerns from the public, and also there is general consensus about the stiffer response against the many evil drivers and drunken drivers is quite fatal as you consider about the intrinsic of a driver licensing system as you consider. And interesting is the prediction of a traffic expert about baby boomers. Actually, the baby boomers in his prediction from one road safety analyst, precaution that by 2030, when all baby boomers are less than 65, they'll be responsible for 25% of all fatal car crashes. So they would be a prime contributor to traffic accident, and perhaps the group of age to disrupt the traffic safety. Then, how do you assess this situation if you are now in responsibility about creating a standard of a driver license and a procedural requirement about its management and administration, and implementation of a standards and rules. So the enforcers, you consider two phases of a administrative law about creation of rules or standards, and so actually they act as a policymaker, and they would act as an enforcer or implementer. Then, do you still agree if the state would continue to renew the driver license in interval of years automatically without any appearance or presence in the driver's licensing bureaus or others? How do you consider it could affect, as contrary to a traffic safety? So perhaps it would really better to interview with the applicant about renewal of driver license if he reaches high age. So actually the policy address would feel cumbersome or troubled about making presence or appearance. Nonetheless, it would not be wise to renew for the senior persons. So the other point of a policy consideration would be any bias or prejudice against the senior drivers. So the measure would be fair. So actually, fairness and administering against arbitrariness would be an ultimate goal we now consider subliming through this class discussion or subject. So, as with other issues in administrative law, there is no easy solution, or rather the solution must be sufficiently fine-tuned that right driving is not arbitrarily taken away from the elderly in a discriminatory fashion. So perhaps that might be brought into courtroom in next decade as well. Of course, the court would be incumbent to craft any pertinent rules about this scope of policy addresses, a balancing test, or any compelling state interest might be contested about a due and fair administration against senior drivers. Still, you consider the evolution nature of a policy environment. So actually, the policymaker need to be vigilant in adaptation and actually identification about a trend of populace, for example, and also the element of a technology involved. So complicated. And also the mode of licensing would witness a kind a tendency in some situation, and what a kind of a paradigmatic shift against new challenges. Consider, for example, the Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB in abbreviation, issued two kinds of licenses to airlines: license to operate at all and license to operate on specific routes. That process has ended in this present days. What does it imply? The CAB officially expired in 1985, whether market forces alone have resulted in a safer commercial airline industry is questionable. Two-phase of licensing administration is highly effective to ensure against damages on the environment. I once illustrated one global issue about it. So that is not irrelevant. You consider, so you now, for example, from a public claims about one new songs, what is that, and about a noise of a air flight. They may reside in the near side, about the airways, for example. So they suffer from regular kind of a disruption from noise and many the licensing administration also has some point of you highlight, like the kind of a public damages, and perhaps might develop into any civil actions for tort damages, or some perhaps state immunity would be a defense on that issue. Or typically, our neighbors in Gwangju City have been reported about the Air Force, Korean Air Force, and the subversive for a decent housing activities against decent housing and a present living conditions. That is a human right what seems to be generated in new paradigm. For example, what you consider then let's think about control of public resources. The main reason the government requires licenses in these situations is to encourage such private parties to operate in ways that are consistent with the agency policies. This statement is concern of U.S. Forest Service about licensing of a timber cutting and others, and also consider a concession stand in a public park. The concessionaire must get a license. You see in the first picture from the public street of Japan. Of course, it depends on national policy about whether the kind of a small business has to be operated based on license or others. In some news headlines, we have encountered the Chinese public response against the poor class of street businesses. They now are required statutory and to obtain a license to manage their operations in the public state. In some states of the United States, also the hot dog vendor needs to obtain a license from the state government. Of course, the public street is quite a critical place. We commute or actually convene or work through the necessary places to be desired to reach others, and we share for some agreeable condition about the present urban living waters, and the cleanliness of public street also point of a concern. We need to ensure sort of public lives, and or might stigmatize the image of nation in some cases for the foreign travelers or others, and might foster the kind of gangsters if the licensing system is waived. So the poor business must subsist under the influence, undue influence from gangsters or others. The kind of situation has been popularized, as you consider in the past Korean stories or others. So might be one theme to provoke a production of cinema. To varying degrees, licensing laws provide for sanctions in the event of a violation of licensing requirement as a means of ensuring compliance. Regulating public resources is usually the primary goal. This task concerns the allocation of public resources and sets limits for aesthetics, safety, and other reasons. For years, businessmen, politicians, and even some economists believed that the market alone could not ensure safe use of public airways by commercial airlines. So I have illustrated the past practice held by the Civil Aeronautics Board. And the safety is also now a stirring issue in the Korean context. We experienced tragic accident, a Sewol the ship has drunken to victimize many young students and others. So actually we have mourned over months, still not recovered about several bodies, and actually some now emphasize the need of some critical measure about the whole of that sunk ship. So we consider the issue of safety very seriously, and paradoxically, the safety in the waterways would not require a massive measure. So in the next class, will address the issue about the volume of regulations. So abundance of regulations would not be effective in many ways. And that has been shared by Korean public in that recent tragedy. So we have many regulations and created through the successive governments. The past government has produced the safety regulation to be compelled of affixation on to the ship face and others. So they would read very reasonably about the safety standard stipulated in details about 10 or 11 items. Nonetheless, we have failed about public in the terms of public safety. What is a prime cause about our misfortune? So the media now display the kind of onboard training about the safety standards. So they have to exercise a physical scene to increase the safety. How to wear the safety clothes, and how to act in the face of a sinking ship or emergency boat in response with rescue teams, and kind of response has been actually deployed as an aftermath, quite traumatic. And the second point about the role of a licensing system would be seen from the point of fair allocation of limited resources. So consider the prior example, recreational fishermen and hunters about the licensing to fish and a hunt. So the government is quite dispositive to pass the government program for licensing coastal or shrimp fishermen. Left unregulated, the sheer volume of people who hunt or fish will soon exhaust or destroy the natural resources in question. So licensing policy in this aspect must cope with the interaction between technology and natural resources. So it quite attract the shape of the creation of licensing system, since the resources are limited, and fair allocation need to be administered and actually monitored about, for example, that the fairness and is important, and arbitrariness in allocation of limited resources might provoke a kind of chance of a litigation. If the sum of interest in profit or other business concerns is gross, then the chance to litigate would multiply. You expect. The need for a fair procedure in allocating licenses is critical. If Smith gets a fishing license but Jones does not, the decision-making process must be based on considerations that are fair and reasoned, rather than arbitrary or capricious. Often, such basic principles as first come, first serve will produce fair results, but this, of course, depends on the subject matter. So consider if any flaws or misdirection about allocating the share of a business license about important national businesses. I have illustrated FCC in South Korea about new launch of cable businesses. In that case, some considerate level of a standard need to be contemplated with the assistance of many experts and opinion groups, and also the experienced administrators. And the third and second point are quite extended in the contemporary terms of a public administration. So, assurance competence in complex and dangerous occupations. Consider if no standard of a medical license would be established in a national context. How do you entrust your body and health with that unlicensed physicians or others? As in the first category, this type of licensing program seeks to limit the number of people in the market, but the goal is not merely to reduce the number of players. Rather, in the case of doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, and other professionals, licensing seeks to ensure their competence. Licensing is critical because incompetence in these fields can cause great harm, and because most consumers lack the training necessary to judge competence themselves. And also, the number of licensed practitioners is also one other issue that has been witnessed over the wake of a professional reform in South Korea. For example, who are those? Lawyers are now in strict quarter, or shaped in justice to respond with demand on market, and many involved interest to counter in some cases and support in other points. And that is not irrelevant in the range of other professionals, pharmacists and doctors. The difference between the assurance of competence in complex and dangerous occupations and maintenance of public order is actually a slight, as I said. And in the licensing system, you now expect there is a sphere of a administrative role. You consider legislative function about creation of rule making, the standard and many guidelines would be shaped to ensure predictability, consider, and legal stability, and kind of points of policy needs to expedite the process in some cases. And also, there is another profile in the administrative responsibility about licensing. So the adjudicative function, consider. And the interaction between two phases of administrative responsibility also is pertinent, you consider, to the next topic, the volume of rule making. So, you consider in specifics, for example, the action on license would not be alike if the litigation arises in cases: granting, denying, or suspending and revoking are a basic pattern you expect in administrative licensing system. And nonetheless, the phase to be employed was actually to be realized by a administrative agency would lead to some different attitudes of a court about a court ruling, and some subtleties in dealing with the justification about a public agency in the courtroom. For example, revocation of license would require stiffer standard in some cases that would not be persistent over a scope of cases. In other cases, granting is quite often a popular subject, for example, which includes the bar membership issue of bar membership. So you know the kind of practice in the United States about bar membership. Actually, it is one of public licensing system, which falls within the responsibility of state government. So you know, for example, a New York Bar Association and Illinois Bar Association, and they in managing the system, they require public exams about that, and along with that exam requirement, they imposed kind of a more some quality and character and fitness standard about that. Actually, for example, we see briefly the case raised from the state of Virginia titled Share versus Board of Bar Examiners. That is the case from New Mexico. And Code versus Gibb involves the living arrangement of a new applicant for new membership. What the state imposed the requirement about honest demeanor or good moral character. Standard code of a 54 versus 60. In this case, Code made a living arrangement by who purchased a home in a rural area of Warren County with Jeffrey Blue, and she and Blue jointly reside there. The state licensing process perhaps requires to produce some comments from neighborhoods and the knowledge of person about his character and honesty or decency as a quality for the membership. Actually, most of evidence produced in courtroom suppose the good moral character of Code. While Code's living arrangement may be unorthodox and unacceptable to some segments of society, this conduct bears no rational connection to a fitness to practice law. It cannot therefore serve to deny the certificate required by Code 4-60. And one other issue, titled Xue versus Board of Bioexaminers, what exposes a very classic example about his a suspicion against the good moral character of others. The applicant, in this case, has a record of a criminal record, and also a list to use aliases in his prior practice, and his a membership in subversive organization in the 1930s. So the case was disputed in 1956, short period after the end of the Korean War, and the time period is quite intense against the communist ideology. So you consider, for example, Sedition Act about communism and others, and the consequence was not quite realistic for some of a bar candidates or others. They may well be in possible ambit about the communist suspect. In this case, Xue would be one person in that capture. There's nothing in the record which suggests that Xue has engaged in any conduct during the past 15 years which reflects adverse on his character. So it is very past misconduct or some quite critical wrongs to be considered as contrary for his probability of success. You see the case is weightier through the three events of allegation: the use of aliases, criminal record, and membership in communist organization. So that well constitute the basis. The State Bar Association has denied his application. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court reversed the decision of board and lower court judgment. The state contends that even though the use of aliases, the arrest, and the membership in the Communist Party would not justify exclusion of petitioner from the new Mexico bar if it stood alone, when all three are combined, its exclusion was not unwarranted. But the Supreme Court opined we cannot accept this contention. In light of petitioner's false showing of good moral character, the evidence upon which the state relies cannot be said to raise substantial doubts about his present good moral character. There is no evidence in the record which nationally justifies a finding that Xue was morally unfit to practice law. So the similar cases would not be scarce across the state jurisdictions, and the state system would not same in its entirety, but largely shared about the standard of a good moral character in others. Okay. Perhaps for the first session of this class, we now have some brief repose, and see you in the next session. Thank you for your attention.